I'd been watching the weather closely since winter solstice, checking for the direction of the wind even more than for snow. The north winds came first. Cold and dry, the pressure had travelled from Siberia, bringing a cold snap that became a suspension of breath. Stillness. 10 days of frozen ground, the air with a quality that almost squeaked with clarity. The New Year's easterlies interrupted the stillness, bringing a bout of snow that cloaked the contours right down to sea level, the hillside icing over, and the waterfall puckering at the edges until only the most determined water could run over the persuasion of ice pools. The ice outlasted the snow, resilient in sheets over boulder faces, opaquely encasing the mineraled matter beneath. Dark tadpoles began to move beneath ice, seemingly shy, then suddenly bold in their bid for liquid release, knowing that the weather was turning in their favour. The return of the prevailing southwesterly brought the melt, the hilltops releasing with an immediacy that swelled the waterfall 6 times over in size. That night, just as the dark month turned to the month of the ravaging wolf, the west wind arrived. I set off from the cottage the following day, taking a deer path high across the land to watch the trees from above. A strong wind claims the woods as its own, cautioning mammals away from the loose limbs of veteran trees. It scoured the woodland, skimming the stiff crowns of the tallest oaks and whipping through the strand lines of purple birch. A woodland is an archive of all the encounters it has ever known, from wind to human animal. Patterns of presence and absence can be read in its edges, just as the shaping powers of climatic conditions can be read in the form of a tree. This woodland is partially bordered by dry stone walls, a borderline first established for the cattle kept here by the pre-clearance community of the land. The trees still benefit from the increased soil fertility long after their departure. The place name, Airigh Drishaig, translating from the Gaelic to shieling of the thorny place, tells us both of woodland ecology and human story, an entanglement of wild and domestic. The thorn is the mother of the oak, so goes the ancient proverb of the woods. The thorny edges of this land, the gorse and bramble, have long enabled the proliferation and succession of trees. Airigh, translating to shieling, suggests how historical patterns of seasonal cattle grazing and transhumance presence grew into the creation of a settlement, where daily tasks and seasonal activities remain etched within the ecologies of the land. In 1875, the community and their cattle were moved to the neighbouring village of Coille to accommodate a local shepherd and his sheep-raising enterprise. The sheep were here for just 50 years before the family emigrated, but it was long enough to ensure the absence of regrowth in that time. In subsequent years, the remaining cottage became home for the stalker and his family. As the deer population was kept high to the preference of the estate, their density ensured that the close cropping of vegetation continued, another 50 years without a new generation of trees. Just 10 years ago, a deer fence was erected, enclosing the fragments of remaining woodland inside and affording partial protection for the possibility of regeneration. Somewhat predictably, deer still manage to access the woodlands they have always related with, a kinship that knows no borders, but in numbers which have allowed regeneration to begin. It is within the age of the deer fence that my own presence has entered the story of these woods. I cross the stile of the fence to return to this land, again and again, as part-time tenant of the cottage and as caretaker of the land. How might my human presence come to collaborate within the far vaster cycles of renewal and stories of resurgence that pulse through this land? Over winter, the point of difference between life and death can seem barely perceptible. At the darkest point of the year, it is an act of deep trust to keep faith in the continuation of the living world. The Gaelic expression Dàir na Coille first appears in the old statistical account for Kirkmichael Parish in Banffshire, 1791, written by the Reverend John Grant, who translates it as the night of the fecundation of the trees. It later appears in Armstrong's Mid-Perthshire Dictionary of 1825. Gaelic scholar Michael Newton collates these references to the custom, translating the term as the impregnation of the forest, and detailing it as occurring on the last night of the year, when it was thought that a wind from the west would plant new life forces into the trees and forests. Another translation, the imbuement of the forest, offers poetry and a sense of the colour and life force returning to a winter-wash landscape, but is perhaps more ambiguous than the Gaelic intended. The word Dàir is the act of copulation, suggesting an animalistic action rather than the more distant terminology used for plant fertilisation. Elsewhere, it is offered as the rutting of the forest, which reverberates with a visceral quality at odds with our biological understandings of trees. The forest becomes imbued with a hormonally charged, antler-clashing agency that disrupts any easy categorization of organism or ecosystem. Once in a while, if we listen carefully enough, we might hear the stories of renewal that the earth has always told. What does Dàir na Coille reveal about a worldview in which the earth and elements are imbued with animate qualities and ancestral and ecological forces are intertwined? This singular thread of reference links to a much larger body of traditional ecological knowledge, wherein the interdependency between woodland and human community has long been understood as a foundation of our mutual well-being. The cyclical nature of death and renewal, and the attribution of the wind with the transformational powers to restore life, reveals a kinship with the living world that our ancestors knew well, that within ecological renewal is carried our own survival. That it was the west wind with this capacity for renewal might reveal a particular climatic sensitivity. The warmer winds of the west perhaps felt to bring tidings of beneficial conditions. Another cultural source, dating from the same period that Dàir na Coille was first recorded, also attributes the west wind with the same restorative metaphysical qualities of renewal. Ode to the West Wind, a poem by Percy Shelley, was written in 1819 and published in 1820. Considered a prime example of the poet's passionate language and symbolic imagery, the ode invokes the spirit of the west wind, destroyer and preserver, as the spark of creative vitality. With a rhyme scheme that emulates the processes of dormancy and renewal, the poem enacts a seeding process of its own. Invoking the forces of the wind on a subject-to-subject basis, the element is appealed to directly by Shelley for the purposes of imaginative and cultural revolution, rendering the animacy of the earth as a shaping power for both poetry and society. Facing the onset of the Industrial Revolution, Shelley must have been only too keenly aware of the effects of the enclosures, the loss of folkloric customs and practices, and the mechanised demands of progress. Within his lifetime, the conceptual understanding of wildness undertook a complete reversal. Whilst in the early 18th century that which was wild inferred to wasteland, by mid-century it had been reconceptualised as Eden itself. The onslaught of industrialisation inverted the wild to become that which must be protected at all costs. The romantic ideals appear innocent enough, but they powerfully shaped ideas of who and what belonged within the wild. The valorization of the wild and the influence of the Romantic movement birthed the wilderness narrative that still holds influence to this day. The definition of wilderness has come to mean where humans are not. The protection of wilderness has been defined by the removal and regulation of human lives. Environmental philosopher Kim Ward asks, how can we decolonialise our conceptualisation of the wild to found a rewilding movement that is based in solidarity with indigenous cultures and traditional ecological knowledge? Perhaps this is to also ask, how could we reanimate or include indigenous ways of knowing and relating within cultures and practices of ecosystem restoration? Out on the land, it is as if the gnarly ancients are pointing the way towards our cultural and ecological transformation, imparting their hard-earned wisdom so that our contemporary understandings of wildness can be refreshed with the changing of the wind. Kim Ward proposes for wildness to be understood as embodying three qualities: wildness as relational, wildness as borderland, and wildness as autonomy. Birch grows as a community, a collective of seeds dispersed by the wind to grow densely together to create protection for themselves. In their strategy for regeneration, they grow as one peer group. Theirs is not an individual quest of survival, but a practice of making walls and shelter together, creating the right conditions for co-flourishing. Not each one of them will mature to a tree, yet the material nutrients from each will co-create richer soil conditions for the next. Fast to grow and fast to decay, the birch pioneers set the grounds for the continuation and an expansion of the whole woodland, just as they did post-Ice Age, colonising the newly exposed tundra. Their seeds travel by wind in their thousands, lodging between rocks and crevices to take root as a collective, growing in a density far greater than most human tree planters would attempt to emulate. The easeful kinship of birch, passing nutrients fluidly from one generation to the next, suggests the relationality within the ecosystem. Birch creates the conditions, and the woodland follows and thickens. By releasing our conceptualization of wild being dependent on conditions of wilderness, that illusionary pure space based on binary premise, wildness can instead be understood as relational, a movement between individuals, species, and the ecosystem itself. As I move through these birches, touching each tree that I pass, and encountering secret sites where antlers have rubbed against bark, relational wildness includes my presence. A damp hollow holds diversity in contrast to the exposure of hillside. Like the seams that run between boulder faces, gathering green beds of moss, so the landscape is characterised by microclimates of exposure and protection that shelter the flourishing multitudes of diversity and have long enabled human settlement. Where one ecotone of habitat meets with another, biodiversity can thrive. Where the margins of woodland rub against the seashore, a tide line of activity is created, with biodiversity that darts between coastal rock pools and the rich leaf mulch of the forest, looping the nutrients from each into a life enriched by their meeting. Even in winter, the territorial range of coastal creatures are tended. Otters, creatures with multiple homes, follow their impulse to see where the tide and the fish will take them, before ending the day sliding ashore to wash off in fresh water, trailing their oily scat into hiding places beneath tree roots. White-tailed eagles cruise the contours of the land and craggy coastline, surveying their chances for the year ahead by tending multiple nests, while skeins of geese above knit migratory paths, bringing remote lands into coherence. This coastal fringe has enabled millennia of subsistence fishing and was grounds to the hybrid blend between agriculture and pastoralism once common to the highlands. The occasional ditch and dry stone wall still run through the woodland down to the sea. The remains of single-storey buildings are dotted through the woods. These shielings were once utilised on a seasonal basis, from Beltane when cattle were brought here from the village for their summer grazing. The community would arrive with all their possessions, remaking the roof of each building before the women, teenagers and children were left to make transient community to care for the cattle, make cheeses, and hold the domestic tasks and practices of community. With their lives translocated to this wilder setting, the grounds for unique culture of relational wildness were cultivated. Shieling culture could be understood as a borderland practice, the mix between domestic and wild, the seasonal movement creating a geographical range that enlarged human culture beyond the realms of singular settlement, bringing ecological benefit to the land through increased soil fertility. More recently, the shoreline is occupied by fixed industry. The flowing burn now sings along with the rumble of a fish farm generator located just offshore, and descends to meet the salt waters and chemicals of the sea. The salmon are raised in enclosures that negate their migratory intelligence and curtail their culture of belonging to both saltwater and fresh. Within the borderland concept, regenerative agriculture, circular economies and patterns of contemporary transhumance could be nurtured, alongside and in relation to rewilding. The fish farm could become a seaweed farm or grow mussels, a protein source more sustainable, with a biological footprint that improves the conditions of the water. The lands could be rewilded alongside contemporary patterns of transhumance, reinstating seasonal grazing alongside group work for tree planting, rites of passage, and creative arts. From micro to macro, the borderland concept necessitates a shift from human scale, recognising diverse cultures of belonging within a multi-scalar, multi-species terrain. What if we recognise the self-willed and self-sustaining qualities of non-human nature? Wildness as autonomy. Recognition of the self-expression of the more than human world affords selfhood to non-human organisms. In recognising selfhood, we begin to relate subject to subject with the living world. Our mutual vitalism is exposed, and with that recognition comes responsibility. The silhouetted trees become individuals in their own right. The sage, the seer, the slug, each sensing and shifting. Individuals roaming and responding to environmental conditions. Their wind-shaped curved and angles of growth inform and lead to the next, co-shaping each other as community. Perhaps it is the implicit recognition of autonomy that makes Dàir na Coille, the rutting of the forest, so distinctive in quality, so valuable as traditional ecological knowledge, and so revelatory in its implication. It reveals a cultural aptitude and the imaginative disposition towards recognising, naming, and honouring the self-expression of the forest. Understanding the ecosystem as a whole It reveals the life-sustaining ancestral significance of woodland to the human community. And yet, it remains mysterious and autonomous, a resurgence that we must trust in, but cannot command. In Dàir na Coille, the intertwined nature of ecological autonomy and radical independence are perfectly balanced. The imbuement of the forest speaks to the necessary regeneration of our ecological knowledge, a return of colour and of life force to our life-sustaining practices. Lichen dust, tropical colours, and diversity grow abundantly even within this moist, lush garden of winter. From the foot of the trees, our ecological selves expand into the forest.